The HR Stories podcast is brought to you by the team at HR Stories. The team at HR Stories helps businesses and nonprofits better manage the employee experience, providing the tools, training, and resources they need to take their organization to the next level. Each week on the HR Stories podcast, management and HR consultants John Thalheimer and Chuck Simikian dive into the stories that matter to small business owners, nonprofit leaders, and HR professionals. We continue to be amazed at how companies allow poor decision-making, lack of knowledge, or in some cases, hubris to cause harm to their organizations. Each week, we discuss stories where companies must pay large fines, lose great talents, and even stain their reputation within the community. And then we tell you how to avoid the same fate. Welcome to the HR Stories podcast, where there is a lesson in every story.
All right, I want to welcome you to the HR Stories podcast, where there's a lesson in every story. Today, we have a lesson about workplace accident and finding ways to prevent them from happening. But first, let's find out what's happening with the HR Stories team and the HR news of the day. John, what's going on?
Hey, Chuck, how are you? Welcome back. Boy, it's the new year, 2024. I think this is the first episode we're recording in 2024. So I think it'll be the first episode that goes out. I don't think we have anything in the can. So that's exciting, right? Resolutions, goals, that kind of stuff. And I'm hoping that our audience members have some great goals out there and kind of putting them together. Part of that is being in there in HR. I was going through the news that I get, right? And so I get the Department of Labor, OSHA, EEOC news, and there's a couple of ones that I want to mention today. Number one is that the Department of Labor is seeking to expand and establish protections for today's emergency response workers. And so obviously there's stuff out there. There was something put in place called the Fire Brigades Standard, which was first published in 1980. But now they're looking at how do we protect those individuals, our first responders, not only in the public agencies, but also in the private sector as well. And so there's going to be more about that coming out. But I just thought it was interesting that the Department of Labor is really looking across the industries and seeing where they can have an impact and putting new policies and regulations in place. And so we'll see where that goes, right? And so just kind of,
yeah, that's huge.
Interesting.
That you know why that's interesting, John, is because I know a lot of times when we think about workers and people that are working, and there are all kind of jobs all throughout the country, right? And so a lot of times we're talking about maybe hospitality industry or other industries, maybe Monday through Friday industries, right? But we forget that there are these 24/7 industries, fire, police, hospital, nurses, on call. I know that a lot of the firemen I've worked with in the past, they're usually on 3 days, off 4 days, on 4 days, off 3 days. So all kind of very interesting dynamics. So the Department of Labor, folks, covers everything. They cover everything. I've worked with churches that say, oh, well, we're a church, we're a nonprofit, we're not covered by Department of Labor. Yeah. And I'm like, well, let's go over the very specifics that would say you're covered by Department of Labor, and you're probably covered by the various laws. Right. So but that is interesting to see how they're expanding and looking at other industries and other jobs that we don't even think about. There's when I was living in Pittsburgh, there's a boat fleet called the Gateway Clipper Fleet, and they go up and down the Ohio River and the Allegheny, touristing type of things, and they host parties, and they have different regulations than because they're on, let's say, a navigable waterway, right? But that's still covered by the Department of Labor, just there's different maybe regulations. Yes. So it's fascinating. It just never ceases to amaze me, all the amazing things. So thanks for bringing that up.
Oh, you're welcome. Yeah, and I think it's just a fascinating story in terms of what you said, right? I think that understanding, and I was having this conversation with a coaching client the other day. He's a dean for a local college, and we were talking about how when we were growing up, there was like 3 or 4 jobs that everyone could do, right? You could be a fireman, a policeman, a teacher, and that was it. And there's so many, like he really works with his students to make sure they understand all the possibilities that their degree is going to get them into, right? And it was fascinating to me, kind of goes into that conversation we were having. So Chuck, I know you've been a little bit busy, not only doing the stuff for HR Stories podcast, but doing a little fractional HR director. I would love to hear how that's going and what's going on in that.
Yeah. So, John, as many of our viewers and listeners may not be aware, I've been an HR director manager for years. And 3-4 years ago, I went out on my own as a consultant. Well, one of the consulting areas that I do is I go in as a fractional HR. Sometimes I have clients that keep me on retainer. And sometimes, John, I get a chance to, I call it sit in the chair. Okay. I sit in the chair. I literally take all of my efforts and I sit in the chair as the HR director on an interim basis for a particular company. So I have had that chance over the last couple of months now at a resort in the Florida Keys, and it has been absolutely, I'd say, exhilarating, eye-opening, and it's a great reminder what many of our listeners are going through on a daily basis when they are sitting in their chair, and it gives me a whole new appreciation, and it also gives me a lot of ideas as we continue our own consulting practice and our stories on the HR Stories podcast. In fact, some of the things, as I was telling you beforehand, we started recording, deal directly with today's story, the type of story today, dealing with OSHA and employee injuries and things like that.
Yeah, any lessons that you would take away? Anything like, I know you'll probably do a action after report, but any takeaways? Anything that you would like? Oh, this is something that I just want to remind people of, or do anything there you wouldn't do?
Yeah. So one of the things, as when you come in as an interim HR director, or you come in as a new HR director, and folks, we have a lot of people that shift jobs. All of a sudden they end up in the chair of a new company. And so as you and I have talked about in our book, The Ultimate Guide to HR Checklists, our Ultimate Guide of HR Checklists, we have a number of checklists there, and we are updating that as we speak. But there are so many things to look at, right? And one of the things I just have to say, John, is it comes down to education and processes. And I guess maybe I should reverse that. It comes down to having a process and then educating your management team. Because when you're a small HR department, you cannot do everything on your own. And I know that, for example, where I am, if there's we've had a number of employee injuries, and that happens, right? I mean, I'm not revealing anything. Employees hurt their hand, they fall, they slip, they do, bang their toe on a door. It does happen. But the key to keeping your workers' comp premiums down, to making sure that your employees are back to work. Obviously, we want to have a safe environment, but you've got to have processes in place. So when that happens, the employees need to know and be educated to report that to the manager. The managers need to know what to do right away. Is it something that requires immediate, let's say, first aid, or we need to send them to a urgent care, or we need to elevate that, they have to go to a hospital, or even more elevated, do we call an ambulance? So they have to understand that. They have to know how to report that, because there are times where if you go a day or 2 or 3 days without reporting an employee injury, that affects your workers' comp premium. It also may delay the workers' treatment if they needed some sort of treatment. And so it's educating your managers, educating HR, educating yourself, who do we call? What do we do? What do we fill out? I'm lucky I have a security department here. So every time there's an employee injury, they make a report. So I get that, right? I get that. And then I'm able to take that forward. But there are other processes to put in place. So that's what I've learned here.
I think it's so important. And I think one of the things that you and I both stress, and I think it's important, is right, not only is putting those processes in place, but teaching your managers and your supervisors how to follow those processes and reminding them and reinforcing them, and if necessary, writing them up for not following the processes, because that's the only way that they're going to do it. And a lot of times what I hear from HR directors and HR managers is, I can't do everything, and they're not relying on their supervisor's team to do what they're supposed to do, and there's manager team to do what they're doing, right? It falls back on them as the HR person, and like, well, I have to do that. I'm like, no, you don't. Your managers or your supervisors have to do that. That's part of their responsibilities. And defining those lines, I think, become really important.
Yeah, and directly related to today's story, there's a follow-up too. So HR, I know it's tough. I know some of you may work in offices. Some of us work, and you may not have this. I'm in hospitality. Those of us that work in hospitality, manufacturing, these dynamic environments where things are always happening, you have to remember the follow-up, right? And so if you see an injury on a golf cart, oh boy, what's going on there? Is this a common practice? Is it something I need to look at? Who is driving? Have they been trained, right? We need to follow up, because that injury on the golf cart could be the next injury that's going to happen.
Right.
That's even worse if we don't follow up. And so it's really just fascinating to sit back in that chair again, and it's going to help us make our next version of the ultimate guide to HR checklists and any other offerings by the team at HR Stories just even better, let's say.
I appreciate that for sure. I think it will be better for sure.
I will tell you, John, I did see a story that kind of follows up with some of the things that we've talked about in the past regarding pins and face masks and with messages and stuff like that. Can I share that?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. So, remember, folks, listeners, a couple of months ago, we did a story about, I think it was Kroger's, and they wanted their employees to wear the Kroger promise. And it's, some people felt that the colors looked like, supporting different groups and things like that. And they didn't want to wear it. And there's a religious discrimination claim and all this stuff. Well, it's interesting that one of the things coming out of Whole Foods was that the employees wanted to wear a Black Lives Matter apparel during the last couple of years. And Whole Foods basically said no, right? And so they sued. But this just came out last month. I know we're in 2024. This is 2023. And the Whole Foods ban on Black Lives Matter gear did not violate workers' rights under the National Labor Relations Board. Okay, it does not fall under protected concerted activity. So I thought that was kind of interesting. There are a number of laws maybe that could have been violated or not violated, but the workers said, hey, this is a protected concerted activity for us to express ourselves. And a judge said the BLM gear is not protected, that BLM related face masks and other garments did not said they did so. The plaintiffs, right? The people say, well, we're trying to make our coworkers feel safe. And we think it also expresses the belief of the Whole Foods. But the judge said no. He said it does not give employees the right, carte blanche, to disobey a valid rule or make it unenforceable. So I just thought that there's a lot of dynamics to that.
Yeah, and I think the other part of the story is that Whole Foods had a policy that you couldn't wear any logo stuff unless it was Whole Foods, right? And so that was the, again, when you're thinking about putting policies in place, and I see this a lot, and people will be like, oh, well, everyone can wear graphic t-shirts. Oh, well, you can't wear that graphic t-shirt because that might be offensive to somebody. Well, then that becomes discrimination in itself. And so the goal always is, look, only Whole Foods, only information. That's all you can do. And that's it, right? And so again, I think that becomes, when you're setting policies, start early on and go, okay, this is what we're going to say. So we're going to say no graphic tees, no graphic masks. We're just not going to do that.
Yeah. But John, we want to be nice. Easier. We want to open it up. We want people to express themselves. And then it's like, whoa, no, we don't want you to express yourself too much. We want you to express yourself. But, oh, wait.
Yeah. And I get it, right? And I get, like, I've worked in those environments that's very relaxed, and everyone, you want people to be their authentic self, and you want them to bring themselves to in the work and all that kind of stuff. You just have to be ready and understand it from your customer's point of view, right? For some places, I'm thinking of an organization, nonprofit that both my wife and I have worked with, very relaxed, very open, and so I would expect that their customers would never be upset if they saw any kind of graphic t-shirt in there. Even if it was offensive, I don't think they would just be like, oh, that's that person. And okay, we're just going to move on. Yeah. But you have to make that decision culturally for your organization and go, okay, so this is how we're going to enforce that and not. So I love that you came back to that, Chuck, and brought that full circle for us. Because we had a big discussion about that. I remember we had a big discussion about it. Yeah.
So, hey, and John, can I just share one more thing that I'm excited about?
Sure, yeah.
All right. Okay, so listen, I'm excited. Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls of all ages, as they would say in the circuits, right? The team at HR Stories is launching 2 learning paths, webinars series. We're calling it the compliance. Well, we're calling the Compliance Corner, where we will be helping you, our listeners and our viewers, learn how to create policies and procedures to keep your organization compliant with employment laws. And secondly, we're doing a leadership learning path where we will be teaching you how to be a better HR leader for your organization. If you want to learn more, you want to go to our website, the team at hrstories.com, and click on the workshop page. And we'll also put in our show notes some of those links.
That's great. Yeah, no, I'm looking forward to that, and I'm really excited. I know we'll be kicking those off soon, and then we'll have one a month, and we'll have the first. Most of them are the second Tuesday of the month and the 4th Thursday. Some of them vary a little bit just because of scheduling conflicts we already have. We're either out doing a presentation or out consulting with somebody, and we just couldn't move those around. And so it'll be great, and it's going to be a great opportunity for our listeners to kind of dive deep into very specific subjects and really learn about them. So I'm excited that we get to do that opportunity and really do that. So definitely go to the team at hrstories.com, go to our workshop page, and get really in there.
I'm excited for this week's story.
Me too.
But I want to give our listeners a trigger warning. We will be talking about workplace accidents and a specific workplace accident in which a young man does die. And according to OSHA, 4,764 people died on the job in 2020. And that's staggering, right? That's staggering. That's not just, someone maybe had a personal problem, maybe it was a heart attack or some illness and then they passed away. These are people that died in workplace related situations. And I just find that, I know we're a big country and I know there's millions of people working, but still 4,700 died on the job. So that is about 13 people a day when you think about it. And so we're going to examine one of them and discuss lessons for HR and safety that individuals can apply in the workplace. And I know you even have a late-breaking update on this story that has come through. So let's take a short break, and we will be right back. You've been listening to the HR Stories podcast, where there's a lesson in every story. Hello, listeners. I have some questions for you. Do you find yourself struggling with HR and employment issues? Are you afraid you could make the wrong employment decision that will cost your company thousands or even millions of dollars? Maybe you're new to the world of HR, or you've been in HR for a while and you just wish you had one resource, a guide to help you get HR right. Well, I've got good news for you. The team at HR Stories is excited to announce a new comprehensive resource, the Ultimate Book of HR Checklists. We created the Ultimate Book of HR Checklists as a simple, step-by-step resource guide packed with 70 downloadable checklists and other resources that help small businesses and organizations get human resources right. Even with very little HR or management experience, you can get instant results with concise, practical steps for addressing many of your tough employment issues. Do not miss out. Go to hrchecklist.com to learn more. That's hrchecklists with an S.com to learn more. And as always, thanks for listening to the HR Stories podcast, where the lesson is always in the story. Welcome back to the HR Stories podcast, where there's a lesson in every story. And this week's lesson is one regarding a workplace accident. So, John, take it away.
Yeah, thanks, Chuck. Today's story comes in 4 parts. On December 18th, 2023, OSHA sent a 75-page citation letter to the owner of Florence Hardwood's LLC with a fine of $1,313,204 that was payable in 15 days. This story we're going to tell will tell us how we got there, and it starts with part 1 on January 20th, 2020. His car rattled and coughed, but didn't start on the morning of January 20th, 2020. It had been a -4 degrees in Florence, Wisconsin, and Paul Henry had to get to work. He would be operating the sorting and stacking machine, what old-timers called thumper, for the noise it made at the Florence Hardwoods planning operation. With some luck and a little begging, he was able to get a ride from his neighbor. He waved to his boss as he punched in only a few minutes late. He was pleased that his workstation would be a balmy 52 degrees, and he didn't have to wear his extreme weather overalls all day. The day moved quickly. Everyone was excited about the Packers game on Sunday, where they were a shoo-in to win the NFC Championship. It was early afternoon when suddenly Thumper made a tremendous noise and went silent. Paul and his coworker, Stuart, stepped back to inspect the machine. Paul quickly saw that the issue, one of the sticks had jammed the machine. It happened all too often, Paul thought. He asked Stuart to get a 3-watt sawzall, and he jumped on the sorter and stacker machine guard. A simple cutting of the board, and they would be back in business. Paul leaned down, using both hands on the sawzall. He cut the stick in half and was about to leap off the machine when the lift table fell onto his right foot, tearing off a couple of his toes.
Oh.
All Paul could think of was he was going to miss the Packers game.
Oh, man. I know you're going to go on to part 2, but I just have to tell you, you had me on the edge there. Wow. Okay. Part 1, part 2.
Yeah, so that's part
up.
1, right? Took place in 2020. Part 2, June 28th, 2023. It was hot for Wisconsin morning as Michael drove to work with his father, Jim. Both of them worked at the Florence Hardwood lumber yard. As he and his dad walked into the yard, he wondered what part he would be working in today. He was hoping that he would be out in the yard instead of stuck inside where the temperature would be hot and stale. His boss waved to him and his father as they walked through the yard to the small locker room where they dropped off their lunch and parted to their different workstations. It was Michael's summer break from high school. which he had planned to return to in the fall to play football. Michael was excited when his dad told him about the possibility of a job at the mill. The goal for the summer was to work hard and make money. Michael was being paid about $20 an hour. After saying goodbye to his dad, Mickey, as he was known by his friends, went into the office to talk to the boss and find out what his assignments was. Typically, it wasn't anything exciting, but as his dad said, it was sweat for dollars. Mikey liked the boss. He reminded him of his grandfather, a hard-working, salt-of-the-earth person who didn't suffer any fools. They talked a little bit about Aaron Rodgers not coming back to the Packers in the fall. They felt slightly betrayed, but were excited that what the new team could do. The boss said to go find the manager, and he would be working in the house, sorting and stacking lumber as it came off of Thumper. As Mickey made his way to his work site, and he was excited to get the day started and prove he belonged with the men, as old as his dad. He hadn't been trained on Thumper, the stacking and sorting machine, but wasn't too worried as he would be working with the manager who knew everything. A couple hours later, he was hot and sweaty from sorting the lumber. The manager called out to him that he would be out in the yard for a bit operating the forklift. Mickey gave him a wave and got back to work. A few minutes later, Thumper made a tremendous noise and then went silent. Mickey saw that the machine was jammed. He looked for his manager and saw him at the far end of the yard. So he decided to unjam the machine himself. He jumped up on the conveyor belt and reached to remove the jam from the machine. There was a tug and the conveyor belt started moving, pulling him towards the machine. He yelled as the machine pulled him into it. 17 minutes passed. The manager pulled into the house where he had left Mikey stacking lumber, but didn't see him. It was awful quiet. And suddenly there he was. Mickey was stuck in the machine. The manager screamed loud enough for everyone in the mill to hear him. The next hour was a blur as they pulled Mickey from the machine, trying to revive him. First responders appeared with the wailing of a siren. They worked on Mickey. The ambulance pulled away, Mickey's father sitting in the back. They stood in the hospital waiting for news. 2 days later, Mickey died. OSHA had been called and the incident was recorded. The manager, the boss, the owner sitting for interviews, strangers walking around the yard, clipboards and cameras. There was nothing left to do but mourn.
Wow. So if I have this all straight, same lumber yard as the person who lost his toes, same machine, Thumper, correct? Yes. And I hear lack of training in the second one. That's awful. That is awful. I can, as a parent, and I've sent my kids out to work, you have an expectation of safety for them, even if it is a lumber yard of sorts. So, wow.
Yeah, it's a terrible story. Part 3, September 7th, 2023. An investigation had been done by the police, OSHA, and the Department of Labor. On the afternoon of the 7th of September, the Department of Labor released a statement that said the United States District Court of the Eastern Districts of Wisconsin had issued a consent order and judgment against the Florence Hardwood LLC. It was bad news for the company, but not unexpected. They had found out to be at fault, and all they wanted to do was move forward. But it wouldn't be as easy as just paying the fine. The judgment was clear. They could no longer use workers under the age of 18. Michael had been 16 at the time of the accident. They had to post signs saying anyone under the 18 was not allowed in the yard for any purposes. All workers would have to be trained in the log out, tag out procedures. Any good manufactures between June 6 and July 6 were considered hot goods, and proceeds would be used to pay the fines down.
All right, John, what is considered? What is considered hot goods?
Yeah,
That's
it was
a new term for me.
Yeah, it was a completely new term for me too. It was really interesting. So I was doing this research, and there's a lot of great articles out there. There's a lot of information from OSHA. And so OSHA says if something happens at a death, right, a death or an injury happens at your organization, especially in manufacturing, those goods are pulled aside and considered what they call hot goods, and any proceeds from the profits go directly to OSHA and paying off the fines. And so it's kind of pulled aside and say, all right, well, these are the goods that you need to sell, but we get the profits and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I'd never heard of the term hot goods, so thank you for that explanation.
Yeah, it was really interesting when I kind of read that. All right, part 4, and this was what you were talking about earlier, really just happened, right? This is we're in the beginning of January. December 18th, 2023, the Department of Labor had fined the company over $190,000. On December 18th, 2023, the company received the official citation summary of OSHA investigation following the death of Michael. It's 75 pages in length, gave credence that the company fell short in providing a safe working environment. OSHA penalized them a total of $1,313,214. And so I spent some time reading over the citation, Chuck, because I really wanted to understand what happens in this particular case. And so OSHA, of course, right, they did this investigation and they found 30 different violations. And so, of course, I can't list them all here, but I do want to list 5 that got my attention. And so they rate them differently depending on the type of them. And so I have some that are willful and serious and some that are repeat and serious. So number 1, willful and serious. The company does not ensure that employees are protected from fall hazards through the unguarded chute floor openings when throwing scrap pieces of lumber into waste chutes. Number 2, willful and serious. The company does not ensure that each authorized employee receives training in recognition of applicable hazard energy sources, the type and magnitude of the energy available in the workplace, and the methods and means necessary for energy isolation and control. So think about your electrical system there. Willful and serious. The company does not ensure that all steps outlined in 29 CFR 1910.147D required for controlling of hazard energy sources are performed. Number 4, repeat serious. The company does not ensure that the sawmill conveyors are constructed, operated, and maintained in accordance with ANS standard B20.11957. Repeat serious. The company does not ensure that the lower landing areas of the stackers and unstackers are guarded.
So, first of all, thank you for breaking that down. It's really interesting when you get into OSHA and the way that they categorize things: willful, serious, repeat serious. But it sounds like OSHA had inspected them before, and the company had not updated their safety protocols or even made changes to protect their employees. Am I hearing that?
Yeah, I mean, so that's why I kind of put that prologue in there. When Paul Henry was injured on this same machine, right, that first employee we talked about, that same machine that would kill Michael, he was injured on it. And if they had followed OSHA's advice back in 2020, Michael might still be alive.
I hate to hear when someone so young dies, especially when it could have been avoided. And I know you said in our production meeting that leads up to these stories, some of the articles are calling this a freak accident. And there had to be pushback by safety experts. Can you tell our listeners more?
Yeah, and so one of the things that I want us to kind of look at and kind of see, right? And so I started reading these articles, and there was a lot of articles, oh, it's a freak accident, this terrible thing happens, blah, blah, blah. But the experts were concerned if we called this a freak accident, we would just dismiss it. Oh, that's a terrible thing. We're not going to do anything about it. Something bad happened. Mm-hmm. But it couldn't, right? Something bad happened, but it could have been prevented. Right?
Yeah.
Sometimes things go wrong.
Yeah.
But they can be prevented. This is the case.
Yeah, and it certainly sounds like, especially when you started off with part 1 and you read some of those violations. I mean, if you were the HR person or the boss, based on everything you know now, what would you have done differently?
Yeah, so one of the things I would look at is the child labor, right? And so Michael was 16, and from what everything I read about Michael, he was hardworking, dedicated, smart person, mature for his age. And Wisconsin does have laws that children can't work in small mills and logging
Mm-hmm.
operations. Right? However, Florence Hardwood was a planing mill where children 16 and older can work. However,
Oh,
as you know, right, Department of Labor restricts the type of work people between the age of 16 and 18. They restrict that, right, from using hazard machine. Um, and where it's allowed, there must be direct supervision, right? And so think about this. Michael was between 16 and 18, and typically, right, his job was not to deal with the hazardous machines, right? And so he was taking the planed lumber off and stacking it, but he wasn't working the machine itself. But the manager left him alone when he was out, right, on the forklift.
yeah. So agreed, agreed. So employers must be careful who they hire to do, the work, especially when it comes to children. I've been doing some work at resorts, and I've worked at other places where there are certain jobs that in the kitchen that if you're a 16 or 17-year-old you can do, but you can't, for example, work with slicing machines and things like that, and you have to instruct the managers clearly on what they can and can't do. But what else would you look at?
Yeah, before we go on, though, I think one of the things that's happening in the employment sector, right, in the employment world, is a lot of state legislators are looking at their child labor laws and trying to make them a little bit more lax. In fact, Wisconsin had on, I think they still have it on there, had a legislation where they were allowing children to do more types of work within Wisconsin, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so I think it's something to think about and not just go to what does the law say, but what is the right thing to do. So going back to your example, Chuck, in terms of the kitchen people, right? It's very easy as a manager. I could be in there as a manager, and that kid, 16-year-old, 17-year-old, they got it down, and I'm thinking, oh, they're fine to operate that machine, and I let them do it, and that's when that accident's going to happen, right? And so we
Yeah.
have to be like, oh, this is what we're going to do, and us in HR have to be really good in there as well. And so the other thing I think we need to follow is the OSHA guidelines, right? In
Mm-hmm.
this case, the equipment did not have proper signs warning the dangers of operating the machine, being around the machine. OSHA investigations showed that the company had already been told that they need to place stickers around the facility and prepare for unannounced inspections for OSHA. And none of that was carried out. None of that was done.
Yeah. And as the director of HR, you always have to, and I always work with the operation teams to make sure we're following OSHA guidelines and regulations. And I'll ask, have you done training on this? And a lot, because there's a lot of laws and regulations, and some managers may not. They're just worried about, hey, I need to get this done today. And they're not thinking about some of those other things. So, look, it's not just about compliance, it's about overall safety of our employees.
No, I agree. I totally agree. The other thing I want to point out, this was not the first reported accident, right? At the mill. As all accidents are, this was investigated by OSHA, and they provided recommendations, actions for the company to take to provide their safety work. Too many times when I'm looking at and we're researching for our articles, I'm reading OSHA reports where OSHA has fined a company for a similar violation that led to a death of an employee. Right. And so it's there. They got the information. The company needs to do it. Right. And sometimes it comes down to not having enough time, not having enough resources, not having enough gumption to stand up to owners. Right. And so we as HR people really need to make sure that we are communicating clearly what OSHA says, what compliance is and doing that, right? And so if OSHA comes in and the organization is not willing to change, most likely it's a culture issue where the focus is not on safety, but on profits, right? And so again, focusing on safety is there. I talked about that. Is there anything else that can be done to prevent accidents like this, Chuck? What do you think?
Yeah, that education about training. All employees need to be trained in the best practices. No excuses. Oh, we don't have enough time. It's kind of like a pay me now or pay me a lot later, with all kind of fines and injuries. But there's always time to stop an injury. There should always be time to prevent a death, and there's no excuses for that.
Yeah, good point. To prevent tragedies like this one, build a culture of safety. Train all your employees. Don't let leave inexperienced workers alone. Follow OSHA guidelines. Hire right. Create a safety team.
Yeah, and hire right. We mean to make sure that the person has the right level of judgment for the position they'll be working. So how do you want to wrap this episode up?
As well, silver lining, right? And so as I was doing my research for this story, there was a small silver lining. So Michael was an organ donor, and in his death, he saved 7 other people, including his own mom. So my recommendation, folks, is to become an organ donor. It's a simple thing to do. Become an organ donor. You may save somebody else's life.
Yeah. Wow. All right, John, thank you. Folks, you've been listening to the HR Stories podcast, where there's a lesson in every story.
Thank you for listening to the HR Stories podcast. The material presented in this podcast is for informational purposes only. Chuck and John always recommend using an employment lawyer or HR consultant to handle any legal concerns or HR issues. We do our best to double check sources and make sure the information we are providing is accurate. We may eliminate or embellish without changing the basic narrative to make the story easier to understand. In certain circumstances, we may change identifying information to protect the innocent. The HR Stories broadcast is brought to you by the team at HR Stories. The team at HR Stories is designed to help anyone with HR responsibilities be better at managing the employee experience. To engage with us, go to the hrstoriesteam.com and learn more about how the team at HR Stories can support your business or nonprofit. Thank you for listening to the HR Stories podcast, where there is a lesson in every story.